He hadn't spoken to another living soul in 4 months when the stagecoach crested the ridge, and the woman who stepped down from it looked at his frozen world like she intended to stay. Gideon Voss had built this mountain life to keep people out. 12 years of silence, of frostbite and grief, of waking before dawn to feed animals that never asked him questions he couldn't answer. He didn't want a wife, he wanted a body to split wood and cook meals and leave him alone in his own head. What he got was Evelyn Hartwell, and she was nothing he'd planned for, nothing he could prepare for, and absolutely nothing he could ignore. If this story already has you, hit that like button, drop your city in the comments, and let's see how far this mountain reaches. Now stay with me. The morning Gideon Voss rode into Harlan Creek to collect his mail-order bride, he told himself 3 things. 1, this was a business arrangement, nothing more. 2, he would be civil but not warm, polite but not open. 3, if she cried the moment she saw the mountain, he'd put her back on the next stagecoach himself. He'd been practical about it from the start. His neighbor, Dutch Marin, had planted the idea 2 summers ago, half joking, half serious, the way Dutch planted most of his better ideas. You're going to work yourself into the ground, Gideon, and there won't be a soul left on this mountain to know your name. Gideon had laughed at him. Then the following winter had come with frostbite so bad he'd lost feeling in 2 fingers for 6 weeks, and he'd thought about it again. A practical woman. Someone who understood hard work, who wouldn't complain about the cold or the distance from town. Someone who needed a life the same way he needed help running the homestead. Equal footing, no illusions. He'd written to an agency in Chicago, kept the letter short and honest. Maybe too honest. Remote homestead, Montana wilderness. 38 years old. No pretense of romance. Looking for a capable woman willing to work hard and expect the same in return. He'd half expected no response. Instead, he'd gotten 6 letters. 5 of them he'd thrown in the fire after the first paragraph. The 6th, Evelyn Hartwell, 29, formerly of a Philadelphia household, had written back in a tone so flat and practical it almost matched his own. I am not looking for poetry, Mr. Voss. I am looking for honest work and honest ground to stand on. I have both skills and endurance. I do not expect warmth immediately, only fairness. If those terms suit you, I am willing to make the journey. That was enough. He'd written back with directions and a travel date. Now he sat on the buckboard outside Harlan Creek's single-room stage station, his horses stamping in the cold, his jaw set the way it always was in public, like something carved from the same granite the mountain was built on. It was the 2nd week of November. The sky above the Bitterroot Range was the color of old pewter, heavy with snow that hadn't fallen yet. Gideon could smell it coming the way he could smell most things, early, before anyone else noticed, because that was what 12 years on this mountain had given him. Not wisdom, just a nose for what was about to go wrong. The stagecoach was 40 minutes late. He didn't pace. He sat still and waited because that was what he did. Around him, Harlan Creek did what it always did on a stage day. A few people drifting in and out of the general store, old Clement nodding at him from the doorway of the saloon, 2 ranch hands leaning on the hitching post across the street, saying something to each other that made them both laugh too loud. Nobody approached Gideon. People here had learned over the years that Gideon Voss was not a man you approached for small talk. He'd earned that reputation honestly. He heard the stage before he saw it, the crack of the driver's whip, the thunder of hooves on frozen ground, the grinding creak of wheels pulling down the main street of town. He straightened on the buckboard, his hands on his knees, his eyes flat. The stage stopped. The driver climbed down, said something to the station boy. The door swung open. 2 men got out first, a drummer type in a wool coat and an older rancher Gideon recognized from the South Valley. Then a pause. A longer pause than necessary. And then a pair of worn leather boots appeared on the step. Then a dark skirt, a coat that had seen better days, a carpet bag held against the body like a shield, and then her face. Gideon had not thought about what she would look like. He genuinely hadn't. It didn't factor into the arrangement, but he found himself looking anyway. The way you look at something unexpected, not because it's beautiful, but because it's sharp, specific, real. Dark hair pinned up imperfectly, strands loose from what must have been days of travel. A face that wasn't soft. Angular jaw, brown eyes that were scanning the street with a directness he didn't expect, cataloging, measuring, a bruise, faint and yellowing, along her left cheekbone that she wasn't making any effort to hide. She stepped down onto the frozen ground, set her carpetbag at her feet, and looked around the street. Her eyes found him. She didn't smile. He didn't either. She walked across the street toward him without hesitation, which surprised him. He'd expected something more tentative. She stopped at the buckboard and looked up at him with those straight, measuring eyes. "Mr. Voss?" "Miss Hartwell." A beat. She glanced at the buckboard, then back at him. "Are there more bags?" he asked. "Just the one." She nodded at the carpetbag. Something in him registered that. One bag, for a life change of this magnitude. But he kept his face still. He climbed down, picked up the bag, put it in the back of the buckboard. When he turned, she was already climbing up on her own, managing the height without asking for help, which meant she nearly slipped on the frozen wheel hub. She caught herself, jaw tightening, and made it up. He walked around to his side and climbed up. She was looking straight ahead. "How long is the ride?" she asked. 3 hours? Maybe more if the pass is iced?" She nodded. She didn't ask anything else. He flicked the reins and they left Harlan Creek. For the first hour, they didn't speak. This did not bother Gideon. He'd lived in silence so long that other people's need to fill it struck him as a kind of nervousness, a failure of composure. He watched the road, watched the tree line, watched the sky. The snow smell was stronger now. Coming tonight, he thought. Maybe sooner. He glanced at her once, maybe 15 minutes out of town. She was sitting with her hands folded in her lap, her eyes moving across the landscape, the lodgepole pines pressing close to the road, the dark shapes of mountains above the tree line, the absolute emptiness of it. He'd seen that look on people before, on the few rare visitors who'd come up this far. It was the look of someone calculating whether they'd made a mistake. He looked back at the road. "It's bigger than it looks from town," she said. "Yes." "How far to the nearest neighbor?" "Dutch Marin's place. About 6 miles east." She processed that. "And in winter? When the pass is ice?" "Then it's further." He wasn't trying to be blunt. He was being accurate. He'd told her as much in the letters. She'd said she understood. "How long do the passes stay iced?" "Depends on the year. 8 weeks minimum. Some years 12 or 13. Another pause. He kept his eyes on the horses. "I'm not trying to talk myself out of this," she said then, with an edge that surprised him. A little defensive, a little firm. "I'm asking so I know what I'm working with." He glanced at her again. She was looking at him directly, that same flat gaze. "Fair enough," he said. That was the most he'd said to anyone in 3 days. The cabin came into view as the last gray light was dying behind the western ridge. Gideon watched her see it, watched her face without appearing to watch it, the way he watched for weather signs. The cabin was not impressive by any reasonable standard. Solid, yes. Built to last, absolutely. But raw, functional, stripped of anything ornamental. The barn was bigger than the house. There was a woodpile stacked high along the south wall, a drying rack under the eave, a stone well 20 feet from the door. 2 horses in the paddock turned to look at the buckboard. Smoke came from the chimney because he'd left a banked fire that morning. She took it in without expression. He pulled up, set the brake, climbed down. When he turned, she was already down again, on her own, this time without slipping. She picked up her carpetbag from the back of the buckboard and stood looking at the cabin. "Is the roof sound?" she asked. He actually stopped, looked at her. "Yes," he said. "The well? Does it freeze in hard winter?" "Deep enough that it doesn't. There's an insulating cover." She nodded as if checking items off a list and walked toward the door. He stood for a moment watching her go. Then he turned to see to the horses. "Dites what?" The first week was like 2 people orbiting the same space without ever quite touching it at the same time. He rose before dawn. He fed the stock, split wood, checked the trap line he'd set along the lower ridge, came back for breakfast. She was up by the time he returned each morning, fire stoked, coffee made, something cooking. She didn't wait to be told what needed doing. She walked through the cabin and the yard with those cataloging eyes and started working. He came back one afternoon to find she'd repaired the leather hinge on the root cellar door that he'd been meaning to fix for 2 months. She'd found the spare leather strip he'd left in the barn, punched the holes herself, done the job. He stood at the root cellar door and opened and closed it 3 times. Then he went inside without saying anything. They ate dinner in silence mostly, not an uncomfortable silence, but a practical one. Neither of them felt the need to perform conversation. Occasionally one of them would mention something that needed attention. She told him the gap under the north door was letting cold in. He put a new draft strip on it the next morning before she was up. He told her the flour had started to show weevils. She sorted it and sealed the canisters better. He noticed in the way he noticed most things that she worked like someone who'd been working hard her whole life. There was no wasted motion, no stopping to look at what she'd done with any kind of satisfaction. She finished one thing and went directly to the next, the way water moves. He also noticed the bruise fading on her cheek. He didn't mention it. On the 4th night, he woke at 2 a.m. to the sound of her moving in the front room. He lay still. He heard the sounds of someone trying to be very quiet while also being very cold. The careful movement, the soft clank of the iron stoker against the firebox. He heard her add a log, heard the door creak back. Then silence. He stared at the ceiling. In the morning, he said, "I'll put a heavier blanket in the side chest. There are 2 extras." She was at the stove. She didn't turn around. "I found them already, the wool one with the blue stripe. Thank you." End of conversation. Dank. Dutch Marin came by on the 6th day, which Gideon had expected. Dutch's curiosity was a force of nature equal to any weather system, and he'd been giving it a week out of what passed for respect. He arrived mid-morning, stomping up to the door with his barrel chest and his red beard frosted at the ends. And when Evelyn opened the door and he saw her, his face broke into a grin so wide it was almost embarrassing. "Well," Dutch said. Gideon said practical. Gideon did not say. He caught himself, straightened, pulled off his hat. "Dutch Marin. I'm his nearest neighbor. I've known this sour-faced man for 11 years, and I'm genuinely relieved he's not alone on this mountain anymore." "Evelyn Hartwell," she said. "Come in. There's coffee." Dutch came in, sat at the table, and in approximately 14 minutes learned more about Evelyn Hartwell than Gideon had managed to learn in 6 days. She'd come from Philadelphia. Her father had been a clerk in a law office. She'd worked as a seamstress, then as a household manager for a family she declined to name with a flatness in her voice that ended Dutch's follow-up question before he could ask it. She'd answered the agency advertisement because she'd needed a complete change of circumstance, and she'd chosen Gideon's letter because it was the most honest one she'd received. Gideon sat across the table and drank his coffee. "And you weren't worried?" Dutch asked. "Coming out here, not knowing the man?" "I assessed the risk and found it acceptable," she said. Dutch laughed, a big, real laugh. He looked at Gideon. "I like her." "I noticed," Gideon said. After Dutch left, Gideon stood at the window watching him ride back down the trail. He heard Evelyn washing the cups behind him. "He talks a great deal," she said. "He does." "He seems kind." Gideon thought about that. He is, genuinely, which is rarer than it sounds. She didn't respond. He turned and she was looking at him with that steady, unreadable expression. "You've known him 11 years, she said. "That's almost as long as you've been here." "Yes. But you don't talk about him much." "I don't talk much about most things." "I know," she said. Not accusatory, just factual. He went back outside. The snow came properly on the 9th night. Gideon had been expecting it for 3 days. The sky had been building it slowly, that particular heavy gray that meant serious accumulation and not just a dusting. He'd spent the day before reinforcing the barn doors and bringing extra hay inside, cutting a double load of wood and stacking it under the eave. He hadn't asked her to help. She hadn't asked what he was doing. She'd just appeared alongside him after the noon meal and started carrying armloads of wood without comment, keeping pace with him until the stack was done. That night the wind hit first, a sound like something tearing along the ridge, and then the snow came behind it, horizontal and mean. Gideon lay awake listening to it batter the north wall, running calculations in his head the way he always did in the first serious storm of the year. The insulation would hold. The roof pitch was steep enough that accumulation wouldn't build fast. The animals were secure. He heard a knock at his door, quiet. 3 taps. He sat up. Yes, the door opened an inch. She spoke through the gap. "One of the horses is distressed. I can hear it from the front room." He was already pulling on his boots. They went out together into the dark and the howling white. The barn was 20 feet from the door, and it took them both leaning into the wind to make that distance. Inside, the horses were moving in their stalls. One of them, the gray mare he called Etta, was pressing herself into the corner with her ears flat, showing white in her eyes. "She's wind shy," Gideon said, moving to the stall. "Has been since I got her." Evelyn stood back, watching him go to Etta, watching his hands on the horse's neck. The slow, deliberate motion, the quiet that came into his body when he worked with animals. Something in him settled that didn't settle in other contexts. Etta's breathing began to slow. "What happened to her?" Evelyn asked. He didn't look up. "She was caught in a bad storm before I bought her, badly managed. The man who had her before me thought you could work fear out of an animal with enough punishment." A silence between them. The wind screamed outside. "You can't," she said quietly. "No," he agreed. "You can't." He stayed with Etta for another 20 minutes. Evelyn found a stool and sat at the end of the barn with her arms wrapped around herself, waiting without complaint. When the mare had calmed, when her breathing had leveled out, and she dropped her head to the hay, Gideon straightened and turned. Evelyn stood. They crossed back through the blizzard to the cabin without speaking. At the door she turned and looked back at the blur of white where the barn was. "She'll be all right," he said. Not sure why he said it. "I know." She opened the door. Sometimes it takes a minute to make sure." She went inside. He followed. He stood in the front room while she went to bank the fire, and he was aware, uncomfortably, precisely aware, that this woman who had been a stranger to him 11 days ago understood something about how he moved through the world. Not all of it, maybe barely any of it, but something. And that awareness was more unsettling to him than the storm. What? On the 14th day, he found her in the barn after dark, sitting with the gray mare. He'd gone out to check on a loose gate hinge he'd meant to fix before supper, saw the lantern light under the barn door, and pushed it open. Evelyn was sitting on the floor of Etta's stall, back against the boards, legs stretched out, and the mare was standing with her head low over her, not frightened for once, just quiet. The lantern made everything orange and soft. Evelyn looked up when he came in. She had a leather strap across her lap, one of the bridle pieces she'd been repairing. He'd seen her working on it that afternoon. But she wasn't working on it now. She was just sitting. "Sorry," she said. "I should have told you I was out here." "It's fine." He looked at Etta. "She's calm. She came to me." Something in her voice, brief and real, that she pulled back almost immediately. "She put her head over the stall and looked at me when I walked past, and I don't know, I came in." Gideon looked at Etta looking at Evelyn. The horse had not warmed to most people in 4 years. She'd never put her head over the stall like that for him, not without considerable encouragement first. He should have gone back out, fixed the hinge, gone to bed. That was what he would have done with anyone else. Instead, he leaned on the opposite stall post. "The man you worked for," he said, "in Philadelphia." Her shoulders changed, a barely perceptible stillness. "The family you wouldn't name for Dutch," he said. "Was that where—" He nodded, the smallest gesture, in the direction of her cheek. The bruise was almost gone now. Almost. She was quiet for a long time. His wife found out he was— She stopped, started again differently. "She blamed me, the way women sometimes do when they can't reach the one who actually—" She stopped again. Her hands were very still on the leather strap. "I left. I should have left 6 months before I did, but I needed the money and I was— "You were trying to get somewhere," he said. She looked up at him. Her face, in the lantern light, was the most unguarded he'd seen it. "Yes," she said. He stood there for another moment. "You made it," he said. He pushed off the post and went to fix the hinge. The first month folded into the second. November became December, and December hardened the way December did up here. Not the worst cold yet, but a cold with intention, a cold that was getting ready to be serious. The days compressed into a routine that was somehow both threadbare and complete, the work of keeping alive in winter, which on this mountain was a genuine full-time occupation. She baked bread on Tuesday and Thursday. He didn't ask her to. He just noticed it was always those days, and he noticed he'd started planning the rest of the day's work to be back in the cabin around the time the bread came out, which he recognized as a thing he was doing and chose not to think too hard about. She'd started a garden ledger. She'd found a blank notebook in the small stack of supplies in the chest and commandeered it, and one night he came in from evening rounds to find her at the table with the ledger and what appeared to be a rough map of the south-facing slope below the cabin. She was measuring out squares with a ruler she'd made from a straight stick. "You can put more down here than you think," he said, not meaning to engage with the project particularly. "The slope gets sun 4 hours later than the yard, but it holds it longer." She looked up. "How much longer?" He came to the table and looked at her map. It was more sophisticated than he'd expected. She'd noted the tree line, the natural windbreak, even marked the water runoff channel from the spring. He pointed to a section east of where she'd marked. "Here, it's rocky, but there's good soil underneath. I always meant to—" He stopped. "To what?" He looked at the map. He'd meant to put a kitchen garden there. He'd meant to do it the second year after he built the cabin. He'd cleared the rocks and turned the soil, and then Margaret had been gone by then. Had been gone for only a year then, and he'd stood at the edge of that cleared ground one morning and couldn't remember why he'd started and had walked away and never gone back. "I cleared the ground years ago," he said. "The soil should still be decent." She looked at him with that particular attentiveness she had, not probing, not invasive, just present. "We could start it in March," she said, "if the ground cooperates." "We could," he said. He pulled out a chair and sat down across from her and looked at the map, and she passed him the stick ruler without being asked, and they spent an hour planning a garden he hadn't thought about in 11 years. He didn't tell her about Margaret. It wasn't a decision he made so much as a habit so deeply ingrained it operated on its own. Margaret Voss, née Colby, who had come to this mountain 21 years old and full of a particular bright intensity that had seemed to Gideon in his own 25-year-old certainty, like a kind of permanent characteristic rather than a temporary condition that the mountain would eventually dim. She'd tried hard. He believed that now in a way he hadn't for a long time. He could see, looking backward, that she had tried. But the mountain was isolating in a way that crept up slowly and then arrived all at once. And he hadn't seen it coming, and he hadn't known how to reach her when it did. And one morning in her third winter here, she'd looked at him across the breakfast table with eyes so distant they were almost a different person's eyes entirely. And 3 weeks later she had packed her trunk and gone back to her family in Virginia, and he had not heard from her again. He'd found out she died 7 years later from Dutch, who'd received a letter from an old acquaintance. Fever, the letter said. She'd remarried. She'd had a child. He'd spent 2 days thinking about that child, that life she'd built after him, that warmth she'd managed to find somewhere else. And then he'd put it somewhere in the back of his head where things that were finished lived, and he'd gotten on with the work. There was nothing he could have said to Evelyn about that, even if he'd wanted to. The trouble started 17 days before Christmas. It came in the form of a rider, which was unusual enough in December to bring Gideon out of the barn at the sound of hooves on the frozen trail. The man on horseback was well dressed for the weather. Good coat, good horse, boots that hadn't done much hard walking. He had a square, pleasant face, of the kind that suggested he'd practiced pleasantness to the point of expertise. He stopped at the gate and raised a gloved hand. "Voss? Gideon Voss? Who's asking?" "Harlan Creek Land Office." He reached into his coat and produced an envelope. "There's a matter of some documentation that's come to the office's attention concerning survey markers on this parcel. Nothing that can't be resolved, most likely, but the office will need you to come in and review some paperwork." Gideon stood at the gate and didn't reach for the envelope. "Survey markers have been where they are for 12 years, he said. "Yes, well." The man kept the pleasant expression fixed in place with visible effort. "There's been a new survey commissioned. You'll want to review it. There are some discrepancies. Between the original markers and my deed is registered," Gideon said. "It's been registered since I filed it." Of course it has." The man placed the envelope on the top of the gatepost, the gesture practiced and final. "Still, the office will need your presence. Before the new year, ideally." He tipped his hat, turned his horse, and rode back down the trail without waiting for any further response. Gideon stood at the gate for a long moment. He looked at the envelope. He did not pick it up immediately. He heard the cabin door. Evelyn came to stand beside him. She looked at the envelope, then at the retreating rider. "Survey discrepancies," he said. "They want me in town before the new year." He picked up the envelope and opened it. She stood beside him in the cold while he read it. He could feel her reading it over his arm, not intruding, just looking. "That's not standard language," she said. Her voice had gone very quiet and very precise. She pointed at a clause near the bottom. "That's not how a routine survey dispute is worded." He looked at the section she was pointing to. It was dense with legal terms, but she was right. There was something in the phrasing that didn't sound administrative. "You know legal language," he said. "A little." She stepped back from the envelope in a way that was almost careful. "My father worked in law offices most of his career. I grew up around documents like this." "What does it mean?" She hesitated, just for a beat, a very slight pause that he caught. "It means," she said slowly, "someone may be trying to establish a claim on your land through documentation, and they're doing it before winter closes off your access to anyone who could help you." She looked at him. "Who owns the railroad charter in this part of the valley?" He felt something cold go through him that had nothing to do with the temperature. "A man named Blackthorne," he said. "Victor Blackthorne has a company out of Helena." She looked back at the retreating rider, who was just disappearing around the tree line now. "How long has he wanted this mountain?" she asked. Gideon stared at the spot where the rider had gone. "Since the first survey came through 3 years ago," he said. "He made an offer. I told him no. He made another offer. I told him no again. And this is the third approach," she said. He looked at the envelope in his hand, the pleasant face of the messenger, the deliberately worded legal language. The timing, deep in December, when the passes would close in another 2 or 3 weeks and isolate him completely. "Apparently," he said. She turned and walked back to the cabin. He stood at the gate for another moment, looking at the empty trail. He didn't like that she'd recognized it immediately. He didn't like that he needed someone to recognize it at all. He stood in the cold with that discomfort, with the familiar dull anger that came when the world pushed at something he'd worked hard to hold. But beneath that, beneath all of it, something else, quieter and more unsettling, the knowledge that he wasn't facing this alone. He walked back to the cabin. Inside, Evelyn was already at the table with his copy of the land deed, the original, which she'd found in the chest where he kept important papers. She had the letter beside it and was reading them both with focused, level attention. He sat down across from her. Outside, the wind was picking up again, the first tendrils of the next storm feeling its way down from the peaks. She turned the deed over and looked at the filing stamp on the back. She looked at the surveyor's mark. Then she looked up at him with those brown eyes that never quite gave you the easy interpretation. "We need to go to town before the pass freezes," she said, "and we need to go carefully." He looked at the papers between them, at the mountain outside, at the 12 years of work and solitude and grief and stubborn survival that lived in these walls. "Yes," he said. That night, after she'd gone to bed, Gideon sat alone by the fire. He held his coffee and he looked at the fire, and he thought about Margaret standing in this same front room saying, "Gideon, I can't do this anymore. I need something I can't find here." He thought about watching the mountain slowly take the light out of someone he'd thought he understood, and the years of wondering whether it was the mountain's fault or his own fault, or just the way things sometimes went between two people who wanted incompatible things. He thought about Evelyn sitting on the floor of Etta's stall in the orange lantern light. He thought about her at the table with the stick ruler and the garden map. He thought about the envelope on the gatepost and the way she'd said someone may be trying to establish a claim on your land in a voice stripped clean of anything but use. The fire cracked and settled. He thought, "I don't know this woman." And then, without planning to, "But she's here, and she's not leaving." He sat with that for a while, alone in the dark. Then he banked the fire and went to bed. Outside, the snow was coming again, steady and soft and absolute, covering the mountain's evidence of human occupation the way it always did, the way it always would. Covering the gate where the messenger had left his threat, covering the trail, covering the garden ground below the south-facing slope, the ground he'd cleared 11 years ago and walked away from. Tomorrow, they'd start planning the trip to town. Tomorrow, they'd face whatever Victor Blackthorne had put in motion. Tonight, the mountain held them in their separate silence, and the snow kept falling, and the fire in the banked hearth kept breathing its small warmth into the walls. It wasn't nothing. On this mountain, in this winter, that was more than most. They left for town 4 days later, before dawn, while the pass was still passable. Gideon had watched the weather with the particular attention of a man whose life had depended on reading it correctly for over a decade, and he knew they had a window, maybe 3 days, maybe 4 before the next serious system came down from the north and closed everything. He woke at 4 in the morning, loaded the buckboard in the dark, and when he came inside to tell her it was time, she was already dressed and had coffee and a tin and a wrapped parcel of food sitting on the table. He looked at it. "I assumed early," she said, pulling on her coat. He picked up the coffee and drank it standing. The road to Harlan Creek in deep December was not the same road it had been in November. It was narrower, compressed by snow on both sides, the surface unpredictable, stretches of hard-packed ice followed by loose drifts that sucked at the wheels. Gideon drove with his full attention on the horses, making constant small adjustments, reading the surface ahead. Beside him, Evelyn sat with the parcel on her lap and the deed documents inside her coat, close to her body. She'd read the documents 4 more times in the preceding days. He'd watched her at the table with them in the evenings, not dramatizing whatever she was thinking, just reading, making small marks with a pencil on a separate piece of paper that she folded and kept. He hadn't asked what the marks were. She hadn't offered. But on the 3rd evening, she'd looked up and said, "There's a date discrepancy in the survey document they sent. The commissioner's signature is dated 3 weeks before the commission was formally authorized. That's not nothing." He'd looked at her. "I'll need to see the original filing records at the land office," she'd said. "Not copies." "They won't just hand those over." "No," she'd agreed. "But you have the right to view them. It's your registered deed they're disputing. They're required to show you the basis of the dispute." He hadn't responded immediately. He'd sat with the fire and thought about it. Then he'd said, "You know a considerable amount about this." She'd looked at him with that careful, private expression. "My father kept detailed records of every case that came through the office. I was his filing clerk from the time I was 14. A pause. "I know more than I've said. About a few things." He'd let that sit. He was getting practiced at letting things sit with her. Now they rode the frozen road, and the sky above the mountains was beginning to separate itself from the mountains, going from black to the particular deep blue that preceded real dawn. The horse's breath came in long, white plumes. The cold was serious. Not dangerous yet, but asking the question. "If the pass gets worse," he said, "we stay the night in town." "I know. Clement has a boarding house on the north end of Main Street. It's basic. I've stayed in worse." He believed her. They reached Harlan Creek by mid-morning. The town looked smaller to Gideon every time he came into it, which he knew was just the mountain affecting his sense of scale. Spending months in a landscape that large made human construction look temporary and slightly unconvincing. Harlan Creek was perhaps 200 people in a good season, less in winter. A main street with the necessities: general store, saloon, stage station, land office, a small courthouse that doubled as the town hall on meeting days. The land office was a narrow building wedged between the general store and a feed merchant. A sign in the window said, "Harlan Creek Land Registry. John Pelham, Commissioner." Gideon tied the horses. Evelyn climbed down and stood on the boardwalk looking at the door. "Let me do the talking first," he said. She glanced at him. A brief flicker of something, not offense, but close. "I'll follow your lead," she said. They went in. The office was one room, overheated by a small iron stove in the corner, smelling of paper and coal smoke. A young clerk at the front desk looked up with the startled expression of someone who didn't get many visitors. Behind him, through a half-open door, Gideon could see a second room with shelves of ledgers. "Gideon Voss," Gideon said. "I received a survey notice. I'm here to review the documentation on my parcel." The clerk's expression went through several adjustments in quick succession. Startled, then carefully neutral, then something that might have been discomfort. "Mr. Voss, Commissioner Pelham he's with someone at the moment." "That's fine, we'll wait." The clerk looked at Evelyn, then back at Gideon. "It might be some time." "That's fine," Gideon said again. He moved to a bench along the wall and sat. Evelyn sat beside him. She put her hands in her lap and looked at the middle distance with complete composure, like someone who had learned to wait in rooms like this before. The clerk went back to his desk and spent an unconvincing amount of time looking at papers he wasn't reading. They waited 20 minutes. Gideon had patience like a geological formation. He could outlast almost anything. Evelyn seemed to have the same quality, which he noticed. She didn't fidget. She didn't look at the door. She sat with that internal stillness that had surprised him from the first day. The inner door opened. A man came out first, well-dressed, 50s, with the look of someone whose confidence came from money and long habit. He stopped when he saw Gideon, the pleasant-faced messenger from the ridge, Gideon thought. This was a different order of person. This was whoever sent the messenger. Behind him came a smaller man with spectacles and a worried expression, who could only be Commissioner Pelham. "Mr. Voss," Pelham said. His voice was careful. "I wasn't expecting you until—" "The notice said before the new year," Gideon said. "I'm here before the new year." The well-dressed man was looking at him with an expression of practiced affability. "Victor Blackthorne," he said, and extended his hand. "Voss. I've heard your name, of course." Gideon did not take the hand. "I know your name too," he said. Blackthorne's smile stayed exactly where it was. He let the hand drop without any visible embarrassment, which told Gideon something. This was a man practiced at absorbing small hostilities. "I imagine you're here about the survey matter," Blackthorne said. "I have to be honest with you, Voss. I think there's been some confusion. The Railroad Commission contracted an independent survey, and there are simply some questions about the boundary markers on the northeast section of— I'd like to see the original filing records," Gideon said. "My deed, the prior survey records, all of it." Pelham shifted. We'd need to request them from storage. "They're in that room," Evelyn said. Everyone looked at her. She was looking at the half-open door, at the shelves visible through it, with calm certainty. "The ledger bindings I can see from here. Those are the registration ledgers for this district. The survey records would be with them." "Mr. Pelham, you're required under Montana Territory Land Code to provide a registered deed holder access to all documentation relevant to a dispute on his parcel. That access is not optional, and it does not require advance arrangement." Silence. Blackthorne's eyes moved to her with a different quality of attention than he'd given Gideon. Not dismissive, recalibrating. "I don't believe we've been introduced," he said pleasantly. "No," she said. "We haven't." Another beat. Gideon watched Blackthorne absorb the fact that she wasn't going to introduce herself, and watched him decide it didn't matter. "Commissioner," Blackthorne said, "why don't we accommodate Mr. Voss? Bring out the relevant files. I'm sure this is all straightforward." Pelham went to the back room. Blackthorne stood near the door, and Gideon stood between him and the bench where Evelyn sat, and the three of them waited in the overheated office with the coal smoke and the uncomfortable silence, and the clerk pretending very hard to be absorbed in his ledger. The files took time to review. Gideon was not a slow reader, but the documents were dense, written in the layered, folded language of bureaucratic record-keeping, and he worked through them carefully. Evelyn sat beside him at the table Pelham had cleared and read everything after he did, making no notes in front of Blackthorne, but her eyes moving the way they moved when she was memorizing. Blackthorne stayed in the room. He spoke occasionally, smooth, unhurried comments about the railroad expansion, about the valley's future, about how these things were rarely as complicated as they seemed. Gideon didn't respond. Evelyn didn't respond. Pelham hovered near the back and looked increasingly unwell. What Gideon found, what he could find in the density of the documentation, was his own deed, cleanly filed, correct. And beside it, a new survey document that replotted the northeast boundary of his parcel roughly 300 yards south of where it actually was. The survey was signed. The commission number was on it. It was the date Evelyn had noticed. He found it himself now, looking for it. The commissioner's authorization stamp was dated November 4th. The survey document itself was dated October 19th. A survey conducted 2 weeks before the commission authorizing it existed. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he set it down and looked at Blackthorne. "This survey was conducted before the commission that authorized it," he said. Blackthorne looked at the document with no apparent alarm. "Clerical errors happen," he said. "Date stamps get transposed. It doesn't affect the validity of the survey itself." It affects the legal standing of the authorization, Evelyn said. Blackthorne looked at her again with that careful attention. Mrs. He paused, the blank space where her name would go deliberate. The authorization date precedes the survey date, she said, which means either the survey was conducted without authorization, which invalidates it entirely, or the authorization stamp was backdated, which is falsification of an official record. She looked at him with no particular expression. Those are the two possibilities. There isn't a third one. The room was very quiet. The stove ticked. Blackthorne kept his affable expression in place with visible effort. I think we're getting ahead of ourselves, he said. These are administrative questions that the land office can resolve. The land office, Gideon said, whose commissioner signed both documents. Pelham made a sound that was not quite a word. Gideon stood up from the table. He looked at Pelham directly. If this comes to a formal dispute, he said, these records will need to be examined by someone outside this office. Pelham's face had gone the color of old flour. Mr. Voss, there's no need to... I'm not threatening anything, Gideon said. I'm stating a fact. Those are my records in your files, and I have the right to have them reviewed. He looked at Blackthorne one more time. This mountain isn't for sale, and it isn't going to be taken, not by paperwork. He turned to Evelyn. She gathered the papers, took her pencil notes from inside her coat. She had been making them, he saw now, out of Blackthorne's sight line, and stood. They left the land office. Outside, the cold hit them like a correction. Gideon walked to the buckboard and stood with his hand on the wheel and breathed for a moment. Evelyn stood beside him on the boardwalk. She was looking at the land office door the way she'd looked at things when she was thinking hard. He expected you to not notice the date, she said, or expected me not to know it mattered. Same thing. He looked at her. You knew to look for it before we came. She was quiet for a moment. I suspected something like it. When the language in the notice was wrong, too aggressive, too specific for a routine survey matter, I thought it might be documentation fraud. That kind of scheme generally requires a falsified authorization. The date is usually where it shows. How do you know that? She looked at the mountains above the town for a moment, that habit she had of looking at distance when she was deciding something. My father documented 3 cases like it in 30 years, she said. 2 of them held up in court because nobody noticed the dates until it was too late. She paused. One of them didn't hold up. Because someone noticed the dates. Yes. He thought about that. About the law office in Philadelphia. The father with his careful records. The girl filing documents from the age of 14. You said you know more than you've said, he said. About a few things. She turned from the mountains and looked at him. I do, she said. Simply. Without apology or elaboration. He nodded once, not pushing. He'd learned that with her. She gave information when she was ready to give it, and pressure didn't produce anything except that flat, private look that told him he'd gone at something the wrong way. We should get back before the weather turns, he said. Yes, they untied the horses. He helped her up this time, not because she needed it, but because the boardwalk step was iced, and he put his hand under her elbow without thinking, and she accepted it without comment. And then they were on the road again, heading back toward the mountain. The sky above the Bitterroot was doing something complicated. Gideon watched it. 2 days, he said. Maybe less. She looked up. Until the next storm? Until it gets serious. She looked back at the road. Then we have 2 days. He didn't ask 2 days for what. He thought he understood her enough by now to know she meant 2 days to think before the mountain closed and the next move had to be made. 2 days before whatever Blackthorne decided to do next. Because men like Blackthorne always decided to do something next. They were 3 miles out of town when the buckboard's left rear wheel hit a hidden rut under the snow and the axle cracked. It wasn't a catastrophic failure, not an explosion of timber and chaos, but it was bad enough. The buckboard lurched hard left, and Gideon had both reins and all his weight thrown right before it fully gave, keeping the horses from bolting, but the vehicle tilted and he felt the axle's wrongness in the shudder through the whole frame. He pulled the horses to a stop. He climbed down and looked. The axle had cracked through about 1/3 of its diameter, still holding, but not for long. Not for another 10 miles on this road. How bad? Evelyn said from above him. Bad enough. I can get another mile or so, but not home. She was quiet. He straightened and looked at the road, doing calculations. There was a farmstead about 2 miles ahead, the Reeve place, abandoned 2 years back when the family had moved to Oregon. He'd used the barn once for shelter during a storm. The structure was sound. "There's a shelter 2 miles up," he said. "We can make that. We'll need to spend the night and get back tomorrow once I can fashion a brace." She accepted this with no visible distress. "Do you have what you need for a repair?" "There's rope and spare iron in the back. It won't be right, but it'll be functional." "Then let's move." He drove the last 2 miles with exquisite care, choosing his line on the road, feeling for the axle's remaining tolerance, talking to the horses in that low, continuous murmur he used when asking something careful of them. The cracked axle held. The Reeve farmstead appeared through the trees as the light was beginning its early winter departure. The barn was cold but solid. He got the horses in and unhitched and saw to them before he saw to anything else. Evelyn brought the pack from the back of the buckboard without being asked. The food parcel, the blankets he always carried in winter, the small kit of tools and rope. She laid things out in the corner of the barn, he indicated, where a partial haystack offered some insulation from the floor. He turned the lantern up and lay under the buckboard with the spare iron and the rope. The repair he improvised was ugly. He'd been doing emergency field repairs his whole adult life, and they were always ugly, always functional, nothing like the real fix you'd make back at your own workshop with your own tools and time. But it would bear the weight for a single careful trip home. It took him 40 minutes. When he crawled out, Evelyn had a small fire going in the stone ring at the center of the barn that someone, the Reeves probably, had built for exactly this kind of winter use. She had the food parcel open and coffee heating in the tin she'd brought. He sat down across the fire from her, flexing his hands. His fingers were stiff with cold from working without gloves. He couldn't feel the bolts with gloves on. She looked at his hands. She reached into her coat and produced a small tin of the rendered lard she used on anything that needed a barrier against cold. She rubbed it into cracked skin on the cutting board, on the leather of work gloves, apparently also on frostbitten fingers. She held it out. He looked at it, took it, worked it into his knuckles. "Blackthorn won't let it sit," he said. "No. He'll come back with more. Better documentation or enough money to make the documentation question go away." She handed him coffee. The fire was small but real, the way fires are in barns. Efficient, particular, throwing just enough light to make the dark around it absolute. "He needs the mountain," she said. "What's on it? Is it the railroad route?" "The northeast section he's claiming. There's a natural pass through the ridgeline. If the railroad goes through the valley, that pass is the best grade for 50 miles in either direction." He drank the coffee. "I've known he wanted it for 3 years. I didn't think he'd go this far." "He went this far because he thinks you can't stop him." She looked at the fire. A man alone on a mountain, no legal representation, seasonal access. He's done the math. He's done the math wrong. She looked at him. "He has," Gideon said, though there was something that wasn't quite certainty under the words. "I'll fight it." "I know you will." A pause. "But fighting it right requires knowing what he's actually filed and what's pending. The date discrepancy is useful, but it's not sufficient by itself. If he has a cooperative judge and a compliant commissioner..." Pelham looked like a man about to be sick. Pelham looked like a man who made a deal he now regrets. She wrapped her hands around the tin. "That might be useful. Frightened men sometimes make better witnesses than honest ones." He looked at her over the fire. The orange light moved across her face, the angular jaw, the steady eyes. "You've thought about this," he said. "I've thought about it since the envelope on the gate post." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had found the barn. He could hear it working at the boards, not seriously yet, but feeling out the structure. "Why didn't you say more in town?" he asked. "You knew more than you said in that office." She held the tin and was quiet. "Because Blackthorn needed to see the minimum," she said finally. "He needed to see that we'd found the date discrepancy. He didn't need to see that I know what to do with it." She looked at him directly. "If he knows what I know, he has time to fix it before it can be used. If he thinks we have a small problem for him, he'll underestimate us." Us. He noted the word. She'd used it without appearing to notice. "You've done this before," he said. Not an accusation, an observation. She looked at the fire. The pause was longer this time, the kind of pause that contained a great deal. "My father," she said slowly. "In his last years, he was ill. Couldn't always go to the office. I went in his place, reviewed documents, prepared briefs, corresponded with clerks and commissioners. Another pause. The partners knew. They allowed it because my father's work was accurate and on time. They didn't acknowledge it because— She stopped. Because you were a woman. Because I was his daughter. Same thing, Gideon thought, in 1888. But he didn't say it. He died 4 years ago, she said. The firm let me go 6 months later, professionally, of course. Reorganization. Her voice was flat on the last word, the way it got flat on things that still had edges. He sat with that for a while. The fire cracked. The wind worked at the boards and moved on. One of the horses shifted in her stall with a soft, grassy sound. Evelyn, he said. She looked at him. I need you to tell me everything you think we can do. He held her gaze. Not the minimum. Everything. Something changed in her face. Small, careful, like a window opening just slightly in a room that's been closed for a long time. It'll take a while, she said. We have the night, he said. So she told him. She told him about the date discrepancy and what it constituted under territorial land code. She told him about Pelham, the fear in him, the way cooperative officials in these schemes always had a limit, a point past which self-preservation overrode the money they'd been paid. She told him about the survey process itself, the steps that should exist in documentation that didn't exist in Blackthorn's filing. She told him there should be a prior surveyor's record, the original boundary survey when Gideon filed his deed, that would need to be located and produced. He told her where it was. He had a copy in the chest with the deed. She looked at him with an expression that was the closest thing to relief he'd seen on her face. That's the anchor, she said. Original survey, clean deed, falsified authorization date. If we can get that in front of someone outside of Pelham's jurisdiction, a territorial court, how do we do that? We need a formal objection filed before Blackthorn can move the claim to the next stage. There's a 30-day window on a disputed survey before it can be certified. If we file an objection with supporting documentation at the territorial courthouse in Millhaven, he said, it's the nearest territorial court. Millhaven. She looked at the fire and measured something. How far? 2 days in good weather. More now. The window, she said. When was the survey dated? November 19th, he said. He'd memorized it automatically the way he memorized everything that mattered. She did the math. He watched her do it. He'd already done it himself. 21 days, he said. We have 21 days before the certification window closes. She looked at him. And the pass, she said, closes in 2 or 3 days. She was quiet for a long moment. The fire was burning lower and neither of them moved to add wood. 21 days. A pass that would be impassable within 72 hours. A territorial courthouse 2 days away on good roads. And a man with railroad money and a cooperative land commissioner who had 12 years of practice thinking Gideon Voss had no one. I can draft the objection tonight, Evelyn said. I have paper. I know the form. He looked at her in the firelight. The woman who had arrived with one bag and no complaint and who had, over the course of 6 weeks, quietly become the most important person on his mountain. We ride for Millhaven tomorrow, he said, after we get the buckboard home and I get a horse ready. The day after tomorrow, she said. You need the axle properly repaired. I need the axle properly repaired, he agreed. She reached into the pack and found the paper she'd mentioned. A folded sheaf she'd brought from the cabin, he realized, which meant she'd thought this might come to something even before they'd left that morning. She smoothed it flat on her knee and uncapped a small ink pen. Tell me the full parcel description, she said, exactly as it appears on the deed. He told her. She wrote. The fire burned between them, and the night settled hard and complete over the Reeve farmstead and the frozen road and the mountain waiting somewhere in the dark above. The wind had found something else to worry at. The horses breathed their steady, incurious breath. Gideon watched her write and felt, under the cold and the urgency and the particular weight of what the next 3 weeks would ask of them, something he had not felt in a very long time. It was not comfort, not exactly. It was more specific than that. It was the feeling of not being the only one holding the weight. He hadn't realized, until just that moment in that cold barn with the fire going low and her pen moving across the paper, how long he'd been holding it alone. 12 years. Every storm, every threat, every hard season. Alone. He looked at the fire. He didn't say anything about it because he didn't have the words yet, and because some things, when you first notice them, need to be held quietly for a while before they're ready to be spoken. But he noticed. They made it back to the mountain the next morning on the repaired axle, moving slow and careful, and Gideon spent the afternoon in the barn doing the proper repair he should have had time to do before. He worked with his jaw set and his mind on the road to Millhaven, the grade, the exposed sections, what the horses would need, how many days they realistically had before the certification window closed, and Blackthorn's falsified survey became a matter of official record. Evelyn spent the afternoon inside. He could see the lamp through the window from the barn, steady and fixed, which meant she was at the table, writing, reviewing, preparing whatever she was preparing. Dutch arrived at dusk like he always did when something was wrong, some instinct the man had for trouble on the mountain that Gideon had long since stopped questioning. He came in through the gate with his collar up and his breath fogging, and he looked at Gideon's face and said, "Tell me." Gideon told him. Not everything, not Evelyn's part in it, not the full scope of what they'd found, but the shape of it. Blackthorn's claim, the falsified survey, the 21-day window, and the pass. Dutch stood in the barn doorway and listened without interrupting, which was unusual for Dutch, and when Gideon finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Blackthorn's been buying up parcels in the South Valley all fall," Dutch said. 2 families took his money. Didn't want to fight. 3rd family, the Aldersons, told him to go to hell, and then their barn burned down in October. He looked at Gideon. Nobody proved anything. Gideon felt the cold settle in him more definitely. "He'll come here," Dutch said. "If the paperwork doesn't work, he'll come here another way." "I know. You need to go to Millhaven." "I know that too." Dutch looked toward the cabin, toward the lamp in the window. "She figured the documents out?" "She knew what to look for before we got to town." Dutch was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You need me to watch the place while you're gone." It wasn't a question. Gideon looked at him, this large, red-bearded man who'd been his nearest neighbor and his closest thing to a friend for 11 years, who'd shown up to help him re-roof the barn in a rainstorm and never mentioned it again, who'd ridden 6 miles in December dark because he sensed something wrong. "Yes," Gideon said. "I do." But they left for Millhaven 2 mornings later. The pass was still open, barely, the surface treacherous in the early dark, the horses working hard for purchase on the iced grade, but open. Gideon drove and did not speak for the first hour, all his attention on the road. Beside him, Evelyn sat with the documents inside her coat again, and her hands in her lap, reading the landscape the way she'd started to do, not like someone frightened of it, but like someone learning it, filing it away. Once they were through the pass and onto the lower road, he let out a breath he'd been holding since they'd started, and the horses found their rhythm on the better surface. "Tell me about Millhaven," she said. "Territorial courthouse. Judge named Carver handles land disputes in this district. He's not bought, as far as anyone knows. He's not particularly sympathetic either. He's the kind of man who goes where the stronger documentation points. That works for us. It works for us if our documentation is stronger." "It is," she said, with a flatness that wasn't arrogance. It was the same tone she used when she said the well wouldn't freeze, when she said the axle would hold 2 miles. The tone of someone who'd measured the thing carefully and was reporting the result. He looked at the road and thought about what it meant to believe someone that way. Not because you wanted to, not out of hope, but because they'd earned it. 6 weeks of watching her be right about small things. The hinge, the weevils, the survey date, the language in the notice, right, quietly, without fanfare, and then moving on to the next thing. "What happens if Carver won't hear it?" he said. "He'll hear it. We have legal standing. He doesn't have a choice. And if Blackthorn has someone at the territorial level too?" She was quiet for a moment. "Then it gets harder. But the date discrepancy is in a public record. Once we've filed the objection, it's on record too. You can't make that disappear without making the disappearance visible." She paused. "Men like Blackthorn rely on the other person giving up, on the cost being too high, the distance being too far, the process being too complicated. They don't expect someone to actually know the process." Gideon thought about the Alderson barn, about 2 families who'd taken the money rather than fight. "He might not stop at paperwork," he said. She looked at him. "I know," she said. The 2 words had weight in them. Not fear, but acknowledgement. She'd thought about it too. She'd thought about it and come anyway. He didn't say anything else about it. There wasn't anything useful to say. Well, Millhaven was 3 times the size of Harlan Creek and felt like a different world after the mountain. More noise, more movement, the smell of coal smoke and horses and lumber that meant a town with commerce. They arrived late on the second day, rode dirty and stiff, and found a boarding house on the street behind the courthouse where the proprietor, a tired woman with ink-stained fingers, charged them fare and asked no questions. Evelyn had the objection drafted. She'd written it in the barn, revised it on the road, and it was 4 pages of precise technical language that Gideon had read twice and understood perhaps 2/3 of. What he understood was enough. It named the date discrepancy specifically, cited the relevant territorial code section, attached a certified copy of his deed and the original survey, and requested that the pending certification be suspended pending review. In the morning, they went to the courthouse. The clerk who received filings was a compact, efficient man named Bryce, who took Evelyn's document, read the first page, read it again, and looked up. "Who prepared this?" he asked. "I did," Evelyn said. He looked at her. He looked at Gideon. He looked back at the document. "Are you represented by counsel?" "We're representing ourselves," Evelyn said. "The filing is in order under Section 14 of the Territorial Land Code. The certification window hasn't closed." Bryce read another page. Whatever he was looking for, he either found it or didn't find anything to object to, because he stamped the document, copied the case number onto a receipt, and handed it across the counter. "Judge Carver will review it," he said. "Hearing within 10 days. "We'll be here," Evelyn said. They walked out of the courthouse into the cold morning air, and Gideon stood on the steps and looked at the street. "It's filed," he said. "It's filed," she confirmed. He looked at her. There was something in her face, not triumph, not relief, something quieter and more complicated. The expression of someone who's done a hard thing correctly and is already thinking about the next hard thing. "Now we wait," he said. "Now we wait," she said. "And now Blackthorn finds out." That they found out how fast Blackthorn's information traveled on the second day in Millhaven. Gideon was at the livery checking on the horses when a man he'd never seen before came to stand beside him at the stall. Well-dressed, younger than Blackthorn, with the particular ease of someone who delivered messages for a living and had learned to look harmless doing it. "Mr. Voss," the man said, looking at the horse rather than Gideon, "Mr. Blackthorn asks if you'd be willing to meet this afternoon. Informally, he's staying at the Millhaven Hotel. He'd like to talk about a resolution." Gideon kept his eyes on the horse. "Tell him no," he said. "He's prepared to be generous. Tell him no." The man left. Gideon stood at the stall for a moment, then went back to the boarding house. Evelyn was at the small writing desk in the front room, reviewing her notes. "Blackthorn's in town," he said. She didn't look up immediately. When she did, her expression was settled. "How long do you think he's been here?" "Long enough to know we filed yesterday." She set her pen down. "He wants to settle before the hearing." His man implied generosity. "He's afraid of the hearing," she said. Not with any satisfaction, just the plain assessment. "The date discrepancy is a real problem for him. If it comes out in a territorial court proceeding, he can't control how far it spreads. A settlement keeps it quiet." "I told his man no." She looked at him for a moment. "Good. He'll come at it another way." "Yes." She picked up her pen again. "He might try to get the hearing delayed, or challenge the filing standing, or find a procedural issue." She stopped, looked at the documents in front of her. "I need to look at this again. If there's a standing challenge, it would come from here." She tapped a page. He sat down across from her and watched her work. This was something he'd gotten used to, the way she operated when the stakes were real. No waste, no drama, just the focused application of everything she knew to the problem in front of her. He'd seen Dutch under pressure. He'd seen himself under pressure. He'd never seen anyone work quite like this. "Evelyn," he said. She looked up. "Why did you really answer my letter?" It came out of him without full planning, the question he'd been carrying since the barn, since she'd told him about her father, since she'd said "us" without noticing. She held his gaze. The lamp on the desk threw light across the papers between them. "I told you," she said, "I needed a complete change." "I know what you told me. I'm asking what you didn't tell me." A silence. Outside, the street noise of Millhaven moved past the window. Horses, voices, the creak of a loaded wagon. "I had nothing left in Philadelphia," she said finally. "After my father died, after the firm, after the household I was working for." She stopped, looked at the desk. "I had the skills and nowhere to put them. I had the knowledge and no standing to use it." She looked back at him with a directness that was almost uncomfortable. "Your letter said honest work and fair ground. That was more than anyone had offered me in 4 years." He sat with that. With the weight of what she'd just given him, not the whole story, he knew there were still layers, still rooms she kept closed, but a real piece of it. "You're using them now," he said. "The skills." Something crossed her face, brief, unguarded. "Yes," she said, "I am." He looked at the documents between them, at her handwriting on the objection, precise and clear, the handwriting of someone trained to produce legible records for people who needed to rely on them. "Whatever happens at the hearing," he said, "I want you to know that what you've done, what you're doing—" "Don't," she said. Not unkind, but firm. He stopped. "Not until it's done," she said. "After. Tell me after." He nodded. He understood that. The superstition of it, or not superstition exactly, the practical caution of someone who'd learned not to count things before they were settled. "After," he agreed. The hearing was set for the 8th day. On the 6th, the blizzard came. It arrived the way bad storms announce themselves on this range. Not gradually, but in a single shift, the temperature dropping 15 degrees in 2 hours, the sky going from overcast to something more serious, the wind picking up from the northwest with a specific quality of intention. Gideon stood at the boarding house window and watched it build and felt the familiar calculus run through him. How long, how serious, what it would cost. What it would cost here was the hearing. If the storm closed the roads, if the courthouse suspended proceedings. He went to find Evelyn. She was already at the desk with her coat on, looking at the window with the same assessment. "If they postpone," she said without turning, "the certification window might close before a new date is set. Blackthorn's lawyers will argue the objection lapses." "Does it?" "I don't know for certain. It depends on how Carver interprets the continuance provision." She turned from the window. "We need to talk to Bryce at the courthouse, today, before the storm gets worse." They went out into the beginning of it. The wind already sharp, the first snow coming sideways off the roof lines. The courthouse was 4 blocks, and it felt like more against the weather. Inside, Bryce was at his counter looking at the window with the expression of a man whose afternoon had just become complicated. "The Voss hearing," Evelyn said. "If the weather causes a postponement, what governs the continuance?" Bryce looked at her. He'd developed, over 2 days of their appearances at his counter, a particular expression when he looked at her, not unfriendly but slightly off balance, the expression of a man recalibrating expectations. "Judge Carver makes that determination," he said. "What's his practice on certification windows? Does a court-ordered continuance extend the window, or does the original date stand?" "I'd have to ask him." "We'd like you to," Evelyn said. "Today." Bryce looked at the storm through the window again. Then he went through the inner door. They waited. The wind found the courthouse's imperfect windows and made its presence known. Gideon stood beside Evelyn and watched the door. Bryce came back with a piece of paper. "Judge Carver says a court-ordered continuance extends the window by the number of days delayed. If he postpones, the certification window moves accordingly." Evelyn let out a breath, small, controlled. "Thank you," she said. Outside, the storm had made its decision and was committing to it fully. They bent into the wind on the way back, and Gideon put his arm in front of her at one point where the street funneled the wind into something genuinely dangerous, not thinking about it, just reacting. She leaned into it without comment, and they made the boarding house together. Inside, stamping snow from their boots, she looked at him. "We're all right," she said, meaning the hearing, meaning the window. "We're all right," he agreed. The storm took 2 days. On the second day, confined to the boarding house with the weather pressing at every wall, they talked more than they had in 6 weeks combined. Not about the case, they'd covered the case. They talked the way people talk when the ordinary reasons to stay contained are temporarily removed by circumstance. She told him about Philadelphia in summer, the particular smell of it, the river, the way the law office cooled down to something almost bearable in the evening when the windows could be opened. He told her about the mountain's first summer, which he'd spent building the cabin largely alone, which had been the hardest physical thing he'd ever done, and also, in some way he'd never been able to articulate, the most complete. She asked she wasn't sure she had the standing to ask about the woman, not by name. She said, "Was it always just you on the mountain?" And he knew what she was asking. He told her about Margaret. Not everything, not the slow dimming, not the breakfast table and those distant eyes, but the shape of it. That there had been someone, that it hadn't worked, that she was gone. Evelyn listened without filling the silence after he finished. "You built the whole thing yourself," she said finally. "Everything on that mountain." "Yes." "And then you kept it yourself for 12 years." "Yes." She looked at the window, at the white nothing of the storm. "That's a long time to carry something alone," she said. He didn't answer that. Not because he disagreed, because the answer was too large and too uncomfortable, and the window seat of a boarding house in a blizzard was not the right place for it. But he thought about it for the rest of that evening, and into the night. And when he woke before dawn to the silence that meant the storm had broken, the thought was still there, precise and undeniable, like the date on a falsified document. Choked. The hearing was rescheduled for 2 days after the storm broke. They arrived at the courthouse at 8 in the morning. Gideon had put on the better of his 2 jackets, which was not a very good jacket, but it was what he had. Evelyn wore a dark dress he hadn't seen before. She'd had it in the carpet bag, he realized, brought against the possibility of exactly this. It was plain and well made, and she wore it with the composure of someone who understood that presentation was a form of argument. Blackthorn was already in the hallway outside the courtroom with 2 men Gideon didn't know, lawyers, from the look of them, city-dressed with document cases and the practiced ease of men who spent their lives in rooms like this. Blackthorn saw Gideon, and his expression went through that same rapid adjustment, the fixed affability settling into place like a mask being straightened. "Voss," he said, "still time to talk, if you wanted to." "No," Gideon said, and walked past him. Inside, the courtroom was smaller than Gideon expected, a low-ceilinged room with 4 benches for the public, a raised bench for the judge, 2 tables for the parties. At the second table sat a man Gideon didn't recognize, middle-aged, with a surveyor's sunburned look and an expression of profound discomfort. He was staring at the table in front of him with the focused attention of someone trying not to make eye contact with anyone. Evelyn saw him too. He felt her attention shift, felt it the way you felt a change in air pressure. "Who is that?" he said quietly. "I don't know," she said. "But he's not with Blackthorn's lawyers." They took their table. Blackthorn's lawyers arrayed themselves at the other table with the settled efficiency of people who did this often. Blackthorn sat behind the bar and the public benches, watching. Judge Carver came in at 9 sharp. He was in his 60s with a face like weathered sandstone and no apparent interest in ceremony. He sat, looked at both tables, looked at the document case Bryce had set before him. Voss versus pending certification, survey reference 1124-B. He looked at the lawyer's table. "You're representing the Railroad Commission?" "Yes, Your Honor. Caldwell and Price on behalf of the Northern Montana Railroad Commission." Carver looked at Gideon's table. "And you're Voss?" "Yes," Gideon said. "Who prepared your objection?" "I did," Evelyn said. Carver looked at her, a long, level look with no particular expression. "It's competently done," he said, which from his tone appeared to be genuine rather than condescending. He opened the document case. "The central contention is the authorization date discrepancy on the commission order. October 19th survey, November 4th commission authorization." He looked up. "Counsel, I'd like your explanation of this." The lead lawyer, Caldwell, or Price, Gideon didn't know which, rose with the ease of a man who'd prepared for this. "Your Honor, clerical error. The date on the commission order was transcribed incorrectly when the records were transferred to the land office. The original commission was authorized on October 3rd, then produce the original commission documentation," Carver said. A pause. Barely a pause. A trained pause. The kind that looked natural. "We would request a brief continuance to retrieve those records." "You've had 10 days since this objection was filed," Carver said. "I won't be granting a continuance for records you should have had at this table this morning," Caldwell adjusted. "Your Honor, the date discrepancy is a minor administrative matter that..." It is or it isn't, Carver said. If the commission was authorized on October 3rd, you have documentation to that effect. If you don't have documentation, I have to work with the documentation that exists, which shows an authorization dated 2 weeks after the survey it purports to authorize. He looked down at the papers again. I also note that the original survey of this parcel, filed with the deed in 1876, places the northeast boundary marker at a position approximately 300 yards north of where this new survey places it. Surveys can be corrected when produce the October 3rd commission record, Carver said, today, or we proceed on the existing record. Caldwell conferred with his colleague in low, rapid tones. Gideon sat still. Beside him, Evelyn's hands were flat on the table. He could see the slight tension in them. Not fear, he'd learned to read her well enough to know the difference. Focus. The tension of someone holding very still because stillness was the right thing to do. Then the man at the side table stood up. Everyone looked at him. Your Honor, he said. His voice was not steady. My name is Robert Cutler. I was the surveyor contracted for survey reference 1124-B. Carver looked at him. You're not on either party's witness list.
No, sir. I came on my own. He was gripping the edge of the table. I've been meaning to come forward for 3 weeks. When I saw the filing notice in the Millhaven Register, He stopped, swallowed. The commission order I received was dated October 3rd, but the order I received, it wasn't a real commission order. I know that now. I was told it was routine. I was paid in advance cash before I started the survey. Another stop. I didn't ask enough questions. I should have. The boundary markers I set them where I was told to set them, not where the legal description said. The room was very quiet. Carver was looking at Cutler with the expression of a man recalculating everything. You're saying you falsified a survey on instruction, Carver said. I set markers where I was directed to set them instead of where the deed described, Cutler said, which was a careful distinction but not a sufficient one, and from his expression he knew it. I was told it was a legitimate resurvey. I was told the deed description had a known error. Who told you that? Cutler looked at the table in front of him. Then he looked up, past Gideon's table, to the public benches where Victor Blackthorne sat. He didn't say the name. He didn't have to. Carver followed the look. Blackthorne's face had gone carefully, completely still. The affability finally gone, replaced by something that was just calculation, just the bare machinery of a man deciding what to do. Gideon looked at Evelyn. She was looking at Cutler with an expression that was almost, not pity, not exactly, something more complicated. The expression of someone who understood what it cost to stand up and say a thing you'd spent weeks not saying. Carver looked at Caldwell. Counsel, I'd suggest you confer with your client about what documents you're going to want to produce and what your instructions are going forward. He looked back at the room with the flat efficiency of a man who'd seen this kind before and had no patience for the longer version. This hearing is recessed until 2 o'clock. At 2 o'clock, I want real documentation or I want a withdrawal. Those are the options. He stood. Everyone stood. In the brief noise of movement and the scrape of chairs, Blackthorne's voice came from the public benches, quiet, directed at no one in particular, but audible. This isn't finished, he said. Gideon turned and looked at him. Blackthorne was looking back with those flat, calculating eyes. The mask completely gone now, and what was underneath it was not warm. It is in this room, Gideon said. Blackthorne looked at him for a long moment. Then his eyes moved to Evelyn. He held her gaze for just a beat longer than he needed to, which was a message of its own kind. Then he stood and walked out. Gideon turned back to the table. Evelyn was gathering their documents with precise, controlled movements. Her hands were not entirely steady. He didn't say anything about that. Cutler, he said quietly. Yes. She aligned the papers. He came on his own. He's been carrying it. How did he know we'd filed? The filing notice in the Millhaven Register, he said. It's public record once it's filed. She looked up. He might have been looking for it, waiting to see if someone pushed back. She paused. Or he might have just reached his limit on his own. Gideon thought about a man sitting with a thing he'd done, with the money he'd taken and the markers he'd set wrong and the knowledge of what it meant for the man whose land those markers had cut into. Sitting with it for weeks. watching the storm build, watching the calendar, reaching his limit. "Either way," he said. "Either way," she agreed. They walked out of the courtroom into the hallway, and the daylight through the courthouse windows was cold and clean, and somewhere in the building behind them, Robert Cutler was presumably still sitting at his table, having said the thing he'd come to say and not yet knowing what it was going to cost him. Gideon stopped in the hallway. "He'll need representation," he said. "Cutler, when this proceeds." Evelyn looked at him. "He came forward," Gideon said. "I'm not... He did wrong, but he came forward. That means something." She looked at him with that particular careful attention, the look that meant she was seeing something she hadn't expected. "Yes," she said. "It does." They stood in the courthouse hallway, and the 2 o'clock hearing was still 4 hours away, and Blackthorn was somewhere in this building or in this town deciding what came next, and the mountain was 2 days' ride behind them covered in snow, and Dutch was at the homestead keeping the fire going and the animals fed and the gate watched. It wasn't over. Gideon knew it wasn't over, knew it the way he knew weather, the way he knew what that look in Blackthorn's eyes meant when it had stripped off the pleasantness and shown the thing underneath. But it was no longer only his fight. He looked at Evelyn standing beside him in the courthouse hallway, in her plain dark dress with the documents under her arm, and he thought about the Reeve farmstead and the dying fire and the pen moving across the paper in the dark. And he thought about a woman with one bag and a bruise fading from her cheek who had arrived on his mountain and quietly, without asking permission, made herself essential to every hard thing he now faced. "You should eat something," she said, practical as always, already moving toward the door. "We have 4 hours." He followed her out into the cold Millhaven morning. They ate at a small restaurant 2 blocks from the courthouse, a narrow room with 4 tables, and a woman behind the counter who brought them soup without being asked, apparently reading the look of people who'd been in court proceedings and needed something warm more than they needed a menu. Gideon ate without tasting it. His mind was running the same loop it ran when something was nearly settled, but not settled. The inventory of what could still go wrong, the weak points, the things he couldn't control. Blackthorn's lawyers were somewhere in this town right now, and the question was whether they were preparing a withdrawal or preparing something else. Evelyn ate methodically, her eyes on the table in front of her, somewhere inside her own version of the same calculation. "Cutler will need a lawyer," Gideon said again. It had been sitting with him since the hallway. She looked up. "I know, I've been thinking about that. Can you—" He stopped. He'd been about to ask if she could represent him, which was a different conversation than the one they'd been having, a different acknowledgement of what she was. She read it anyway. "I'm not a lawyer," she said. I can't represent anyone officially, but I can help him understand what he's facing and what his options are." She paused. "If he wants that." He came forward in a room full of people who had reason to make his life difficult, Gideon said. "He probably wants whatever help is available." She nodded once, the settled nod she gave when she'd decided something. After 2 o'clock. They finished eating. The woman behind the counter refilled their coffee without asking. Outside, the Millhaven street moved past the window. A normal December afternoon, people going about normal business, none of them knowing or caring what was happening 4 blocks away in a low-ceilinged courtroom. Gideon looked at Evelyn across the table and thought about all the things that had been said in the last 8 days, and all the things that hadn't been. And the distance between those 2 categories felt both very large and, for the first time, not permanent. "After," he said. She looked at him. She knew what he meant. He'd said it in the boarding house, "Tell me after." And something in her face shifted just slightly, the way a door shifts when someone puts their hand on the knob without opening it yet. "After," she agreed. They were back at the courthouse at 1:45. Bryce was at his counter with an expression that suggested the morning had been eventful in the inner offices. He looked at them, looked at the clock, and said, "Judge Carver wants to see both parties in chambers before the hearing resumes." Gideon and Evelyn exchanged a look. Gideon followed Bryce through the inner door. Carver's chambers were a small room behind the courtroom, books on every surface, a window overlooking the alley behind the building where someone had left a broken wagon wheel propped against the wall. Carver was at his desk. Across from him sat Caldwell. 1 lawyer, not 2, which was itself a data point. Blackthorn was not present. Carver looked at Gideon, then at Evelyn, then back to his desk. "Caldwell has brought me a proposal," Carver said.
I want you to hear it in this room rather than in open proceedings, because depending on your response, it affects what happens at 2 o'clock. Gideon sat. Evelyn sat beside him. Caldwell had the look of a man who'd spent 4 hours receiving instructions he didn't entirely agree with. He set a document on Carver's desk. My client is prepared to withdraw the survey certification application, he said, in exchange for a confidential settlement that includes a payment to Mr. Voss for— No, Gideon said. Caldwell stopped. I'll hear the full terms, Carver said, with a glance at Gideon that said let him finish. In exchange for a payment to Mr. Voss for reasonable legal costs incurred, and a mutual agreement not to pursue further action on either side. Caldwell's voice was professionally flat. The survey is withdrawn. Mr. Voss retains his parcel without encumbrance. The matter ends here. The room was quiet. Gideon looked at Carver. And Cutler? Caldwell shifted. Mr. Cutler's situation is between him and whatever relevant authorities. Cutler came forward in open court and implicated your client in a land fraud scheme, Evelyn said. Her voice was level. A settlement that buries the certification issue doesn't address the underlying conduct. The falsified authorization document is still in the Harlan Creek Land Office files. Commissioner Pelham's signature is on it. Caldwell looked at her. Mrs. A confidential settlement protects your client from civil liability on this specific claim, she continued. It does not protect him from a criminal referral regarding the falsified commission order, which is a separate matter and not within Mr. Voss's power to resolve even if he wanted to. Silence. Carver was looking at Evelyn with the same recalibrating expression Bryce had given her 2 days ago, a man revising an assumption mid-conversation. She's right, Carver said to Caldwell. The falsification issue goes beyond this proceeding. I have an obligation to refer it regardless of what the parties agree. Caldwell's jaw worked. He was clearly receiving from some internal channel the communications of a man whose client had not fully prepared him for this contingency. Then what does Mr. Voss want? Caldwell said finally, directing the question at Gideon with the slightly desperate energy of a man trying to get back to solid ground. Gideon thought about it. He thought about the mountain, about 12 years of work, about the Alderson barn burning in October, about 2 families who'd taken the money and lost their ground anyway, probably, in the long run, because men like Blackthorne didn't stop when they got one parcel, they moved to the next. I want the survey withdrawn, he said, formally, on the public record, not confidentially. I want the falsified commission order flagged for review by the territorial attorney, and I want Blackthorne's application for the railroad right-of-way through my northeast section denied permanently. Caldwell stared at him. The right-of-way denial isn't within the scope of this. It is if your client withdraws the survey and acknowledges the boundary markers as originally filed, Evelyn said. Without the falsified boundary, there's no viable route through the northeast section for the railroad grade. The geography doesn't support it. A withdrawal with acknowledgement of the original markers effectively resolves the right-of-way. Caldwell looked at Carver. Carver looked at Carver's window. I'll give you 30 minutes to consult with your client, Carver said. The 30 minutes became 50. Gideon and Evelyn waited in the hallway on a wooden bench, and the courthouse settled into the particular quiet of a building waiting for something to be decided. Evelyn had her hands in her lap. Gideon sat with his forearms on his knees, looking at the floor. If he says no, Gideon said, then we proceed at 2 o'clock with Cutler's testimony on the record and Carver makes a determination, she said, which Blackthorne's lawyers know will go against them. They're not in this room trying to settle because they think they're winning. He said it wasn't finished. He meant outside the courtroom. She was quiet for a moment. Men like Blackthorne have a sequence. First the paperwork, then the settlement, then— She didn't finish. Then the Alderson approach, Gideon said. Maybe. She looked at the courthouse wall across from them. But it's harder to do that after a public withdrawal and a criminal referral. It draws attention to him specifically. He's more visible now than he was when he thought this was a quiet administrative matter. That doesn't make it impossible. No, she said, it doesn't. He looked at her profile, the set of her jaw, the lines around her eyes that were faint. But there, the mark of a person who'd spent years in situations where she had to be careful. When we get back, he said, Dutch is going to have opinions about security arrangements. Dutch seems like a man with opinions about most things. He is. He's usually right. Gideon paused. I'm going to listen to him this time. She turned and looked at him. You don't always?
I listen. I don't always. He stopped. I've gotten used to making decisions alone. It's a hard habit.
She held his gaze for a moment. There was something in her expression, not quite a smile, not quite not one.
I know,
she said. The inner door opened. Bryce leaned out. Judge Carver's ready. They filed back in. Caldwell was already at his table, his document case open, his expression resolved into something professional and closed. Blackthorn was not in the public benches. That absence was its own kind of answer. Cutler was still at his side table, Gideon noticed. Still there, after 4 hours. Still gripping the edge of it. Carver settled at the bench and looked at both tables. Counsel, he said to Caldwell. Caldwell stood. Your Honor, my client withdraws Survey Reference 1124-B in its entirety. The withdrawal is unconditional and entered on the public record. My client further acknowledges the boundary markers as established in the original 1876 survey of the Voss parcel. Carver wrote. He wrote for longer than seemed necessary, which Gideon read as deliberateness, a man making sure the record was complete. The withdrawal is accepted and entered, Carver said. The certification application is void. The original boundary markers stand as filed. He looked up. Regarding the authorization date discrepancy in the commission order, I'm referring that document to the Territorial Attorney's Office for review. That referral is not contingent on today's settlement and is not subject to any private agreement between the parties. He looked at Caldwell. Your client is free to obtain separate counsel regarding that matter. Caldwell nodded. He was already closing his document case. Mr. Cutler, Carver said. Cutler looked up with the expression of a man who'd been waiting for the floor to fall through. Your voluntary testimony today is noted in the record, Carver said. I'd strongly suggest you obtain legal representation before the attorney's office contacts you, which they will. A pause. Coming forward voluntarily is relevant to how these things proceed. It doesn't make them go away, but it's relevant. Cutler nodded. His face had gone through several things in rapid succession and settled on something that looked, exhaustedly, like relief. Carver gathered his papers and stood. Everyone stood. And that was it. No fanfare, no dramatic pronouncement, just a judge leaving a room and a clerk filing papers, and the sound of Caldwell's footsteps on the wooden floor going toward the door without looking back. Gideon sat for a moment after everyone else had moved. The mountain was still there, still his. The boundary markers were where they'd always been, where he'd stood 100 times at the northeast edge and looked at the pass through the ridgeline and known it was the best piece of ground in the valley. It was still that. It would still be that tomorrow and next year and 20 years from now, if he held it. Evelyn was standing beside the table, documents gathered, and she was looking at him with an expression he hadn't seen on her before, open, unguarded in a way that her face rarely allowed. Something that might have been, if he had to put a name to it, the look of a person who is somewhere they didn't fully expect to be and finds it better than they'd calculated. He stood up. It's done, he said. It's done, she said. They stood there in the emptying courtroom, and neither of them did anything dramatic because they were not dramatic people. They were people who had learned that life asked for steadiness more than it asked for ceremony. But something passed between them in that room that both of them felt, and neither of them deflected. And it settled into the space between them like something that intended to stay. They found Cutler in the hallway. He was sitting on the same bench where Gideon and Evelyn had waited, his hat in his hands, turning it slowly. He looked up when they approached. His face braced for something, judgment, maybe, or anger. Gideon stopped in front of him. You came forward, Gideon said. Cutler looked at his hat. Took me long enough. You came forward, Gideon said again. Not forgiving, not condemning, just the fact of it. Cutler looked up. I didn't know it was your land, specifically when I started. I mean, I knew there was a deed holder. I knew the markers I was setting were wrong, but I told myself I didn't know. He stopped. That's not true. I knew enough. I just needed the money, and I told myself it was a small thing. 300 yards, Gideon said. 300 yards. Cutler's voice was hollow. I've spent 30 years doing honest survey work.
30 years. He shook his head. One job. One.
You'll need a lawyer, Evelyn said. Not harsh. Practical. The same voice she used for things that needed doing. Before the territorial attorney's office contacts you, if you cooperate fully and you can document what you were told and by whom, that's relevant to how the proceeding goes. Cutler looked at her. The same recalibrating look everyone gave her, the adjustment between expectation and reality. I have everything, he said. The original instruction letter, the cash receipt. I kept it. I don't know why, I kept it. He swallowed. It has Blackthorn's company letterhead. Evelyn was still for a moment. Keep that, she said carefully. Keep it somewhere safe. Not at your home or your office. Somewhere he can't access. She paused. Do you understand why I'm saying that? Cutler looked at her, and something in his expression told Gideon that Cutler had heard about the Alderson barn too. Yes, Cutler said. I understand. They left him on the bench. Outside, the afternoon had gone cold in the way December afternoons went cold, abruptly, like a door closing. The light was already failing, the mountains west of town catching the last of it on their upper faces while the valley went to shadow. Gideon untied the horses from the rail where they'd stood patient all day. He checked their feet, checked the tack, ran his hand along the near horse's neck the way he always did before a road. We should stay another night, he said. Start home in the morning with the full day. Yes, Evelyn said. He helped her up, not because she needed it, but because the gesture had become natural somewhere in the last 10 days, and she accepted it the same way, without comment, without either of them making it into something it wasn't quite yet. They rode to the boarding house through the dimming streets, and the proprietor with the ink-stained fingers gave them the same rooms without being asked, and at dinner in the small front room she brought them food and left them alone, and they sat across from each other with the day behind them and the road home in front of them, and both of them arrived, finally, at the thing they'd agreed to say after. It was Gideon who started it, which surprised him. He was not a man who started things. But the day had done something to him, or maybe the last 8 weeks had, and sitting across from her in the warm front room with the day's work done, the 12 years of practiced silence felt less like armor and more like a habit he'd outgrown without noticing. What you did in that courtroom, he said, and in the land office, and in that barn in the Reeve place at 10 at night, writing the objection with your coat on. He stopped. You didn't have to do any of that. You came here for... I wrote honest work and fair ground. That's not this. She looked at him steadily. It's exactly this, she said. Honest work and fair ground. That's all I asked for. You asked for a household to manage, not a land fight. You asked for a capable woman, she said. I am a capable woman. This is what capable looks like. Something shifted in her voice, quieter, more careful. I didn't come here just to cook and keep the fire. I came here because I needed somewhere to put what I know, somewhere it would matter. She looked at the table. It mattered here. He sat with that. It did, he said. She looked up. It does, he said. The correction deliberate, present tense. The fire in the small hearth across the room put its warmth into the space between them, and neither of them moved toward or away from the other, and the evening held still for a moment in the particular way evenings hold still when something real is being said. I want to stay, she said. Not a question. I know, he said. I want to stay because I want to, she said. Not because I have nowhere else. I need you to understand that. He looked at her. This woman who had arrived on his mountain with one bag and no complaint, and had spent 6 weeks quietly becoming the most essential person in his life, who had done it not by softening herself to fit the space he'd left, but by being exactly, stubbornly, specifically herself. I understand that, he said. I need you to understand something too. She waited. I'm not easy to live with, he said. I know that. I go quiet for days. I'm better with horses than people. I spent 12 years making sure I didn't need anyone, and that's not a small thing to undo. I know, she said. I've been living with you for 6 weeks. Right, so you know. I know, she said again, with a tone that meant, and I'm still here. He looked at her hands on the table, the ink stain on her right forefinger from the hours of writing, the roughened knuckles from 6 weeks of homestead work, the particular competence in the way they rested. It would be a real marriage, he said, not just an arrangement. She held his gaze for a long, careful moment. Yes, she said. It would have to be. Then that's what it is, he said. No ceremony, no speeches, just two people who had looked at each other clearly without prettying it up and decided that what they saw was worth the work. Outside, the Millhaven night had settled completely over the valley, and somewhere beyond the mountains the road home wound up through the pass toward the cabin and the barn and the gray mare and Dutch's cold fire and the garden ground below the south-facing slope that would need turning come March. Gideon looked at her across the table. Get some sleep, he said. The road tomorrow is long. I know the road, she said. She did. That was the thing. She knew the road now, the way she knew the axle and the survey date and the authorization code and the name of every animal in the barn. She'd learned it because that was what she did. She learned the things that mattered and held on to them. He went to bed and lay in the dark, listening to the boarding house settle around him. And for the first time in 12 years, the silence felt like something other than punishment. It felt, quietly and improbably, like the beginning of something. The road home took longer than expected. Not because of weather, the pass held, cold but passable, the horses steady on the grade, but because somewhere in the last 8 days, the distance between Millhaven and the mountain had acquired a different weight. Gideon drove and didn't push the pace, and Evelyn sat beside him with her hands in her lap, and the valley opened up around them the way it always did, coming back from town, wider than you remembered, quieter, the mountains pressing close on both sides like something that had been waiting. Neither of them talked much. That had always been true between them, but the silence now was different in quality. Not the cautious silence of two strangers sharing a space, not the functional silence of people focused on work. Something settled. Something that had found its shape. They stopped once to water the horses at the creek crossing where the ice had thinned enough in the afternoon sun to break through. Evelyn climbed down and stood at the creek's edge while the horses drank, looking at the water moving black and quick under the shelf of ice at the bank. Gideon stood beside her. Blackthorn won't just disappear, she said. Not anxious, just honest. She'd been honest about hard things from the beginning, and he didn't expect that to stop. No, he said. The attorney's office will move slow. These things always move slow. He'll have lawyers managing it for months, maybe longer. I know. He might still come at the mountain another way. Not documentation, something else. Dutch has 3 brothers in the valley, Gideon said. And the Aldersons, after their barn, have been talking to every neighbor within 20 miles. Blackthorn's name is not popular in this part of Montana right now. He looked at the water. He'll find easier ground somewhere else. Men like him usually do, when the cost goes up. She looked at him. You believe that? He considered it honestly, the way she'd always asked him to consider things. I think he's a man who calculates, he said. He calculated that I was alone and isolated and didn't know what he was doing until it was done. All 3 of those calculations are wrong now. He'll recalculate. A pause. That doesn't mean he's gone. It means he's a different kind of problem, a smaller one. She looked back at the water for a moment. Then she nodded, the settled nod. They got back on the buckboard and drove the last miles home. Dutch was at the cabin when they arrived, which Gideon had expected. What he hadn't expected was Dutch sitting at the kitchen table with a pot of coffee already made, looking at them when they came through the door with an expression of such unconcealed relief that it was almost embarrassing. Well, Dutch said. He looked at their faces. Well, he said again, differently. The survey is withdrawn, Gideon said, publicly, on record. Carver referred the falsification to the territorial attorney. Dutch set down his coffee. He looked at Evelyn. You did this, he said. Not a question. We did it, Evelyn said. Dutch looked at Gideon. Gideon looked back at him with an expression that said, don't. Dutch, for once in 11 years, listened. He picked up his coffee, drank it, and said, The gray mare's been asking for you, to Evelyn. Goes to the stall door every morning around the time you'd usually come out. Something crossed Evelyn's face, quick and real, the expression she got when something caught her off guard by being kind. I'll go see her, she said, and went back out. And Dutch waited until the door closed. Then he looked at Gideon with 11 years of friendship and approximately no restraint. Real marriage, he said. Yes, Gideon said. Dutch's face broke into that enormous grin. He opened his mouth. Don't, Gideon said. Dutch closed his mouth. The grin stayed. He stood up, picked up his coat from the chair, and put it on with the elaborate casualness of a man exercising heroic self-control. I'll come back Saturday, he said. For dinner. Fine, Gideon said. I'll bring the Marin apple brandy. Bring 2 bottles, Gideon said. And invite the Aldersons. Dutch stopped at the door and looked back. Something genuine moved through the grin, something that was just warmth. Just the plain warmth of a man who'd watched his friend survive 12 hard years and was glad to see what came after. Gideon, he said. Dutch. Good, Dutch said, and went out. January settled over the mountain with its full weight. The cold that came in the last week of the month was serious. Not dangerous if you were prepared and they were prepared, but serious in the way that asked something of you every single day. The kind of cold that got into the walls of the cabin at 3 in the morning and woke you with the sound of the timber contracting. The kind that made the horse's water freeze in the time it took to carry it from the well to the barn. They worked through it the way they worked through everything, together, without ceremony, without making it harder than it was by adding words to it that it didn't need. Gideon split the wood. Evelyn kept the fire. He handled the animals. She kept the food stores cataloged and stretched. In the evenings, they sat by the fire and she worked on the garden ledger, expanded now, revised for spring, annotated with notes from Gideon about soil and drainage and which sections held frost longest. And he worked on whatever needed repairing because there was always something that needed repairing. They argued twice that month. Real arguments, not the surface friction of people still being polite. The first was about the northeast fence line. Gideon wanted to reinforce it before spring. Evelyn thought the materials would be better spent on the root cellar's failing east wall, which she'd been monitoring and which she believed was more urgent. The argument had the particular shape of 2 people who were both right about different aspects of the same problem, and it went on for 2 days before Gideon looked at the east wall himself, really looked at it, and said, "You're right about the timeline," which cost him something, and he knew she knew it cost him something, and she didn't make anything of that, just said, "We can do the fence in April," which was also right. The second argument was harder. It was about Margaret, not directly. It didn't start that way. It started with something small. Gideon going quiet for 3 days in the way he sometimes went quiet, disappearing into himself in the manner she'd observed since the beginning, the deep withdrawal that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with whatever country existed inside him that he hadn't yet found a way to map for anyone else. She'd lived with it for 2 months by then. She'd given it room. But on the 3rd day, she'd said quietly at breakfast, "I need you to tell me when you go there. Not what it is, just that you're there and you'll come back." He'd looked at her. "I need to know," she said, "that this is different from before. That I'm not going to look up in 6 months and find that nothing I do reaches you." It landed hard because she'd aimed it carefully. Not cruel, but precise. The truth delivered the way she delivered most truths. Flat, direct, without the softening that would have made it easier to dismiss. He'd sat with it for long enough that she'd started to get up from the table. "Margaret left in the 3rd winter," he said. She stopped. "She left because I didn't know how to—" He stopped. Started again. "I kept thinking if I just worked harder, if the homestead was more secure, if there was less to worry about, then she'd be—" He looked at the table. "I thought the problem was the mountain. It wasn't the mountain. It was that I didn't know how to let someone in, and I didn't know that." Evelyn sat back down. "I'm telling you now," he said, "that I go somewhere sometimes and it's not about you. It's a habit, a 12-year habit. I'm trying to break it." He looked at her directly. "I will tell you when I'm there. If you'll tell me when I've done something that makes you feel like you're repeating a mistake." Her jaw tightened slightly. "You're not the only one with old damage," she said. "I know. The man in Philadelphia," she said. "The household. I get careful sometimes. Careful in a way that's not about you. That's its own thing." "I know," he said. "I've seen it." She looked at him. "You have? The way you check the gate before you come in, the way you listen for horses on the trail before you relax." He said it without judgment, just the observation. "I notice things." She was quiet for a moment. Something moved through her expression, the discomfort of being seen accurately, which was a different discomfort than being seen wrong. "We're both bringing damage to this," she said. "Yes," he said. "That's what people do." She looked at the fire. He looked at her. "I'm not going to stop being difficult," she said. "I'm not either," he said. "Then we're agreed," she said. It wasn't a resolution, not the kind that wrapped things up cleanly. It was more like two people planting a stake in the ground together and agreeing, roughly, that this was where they were going to stand. That was enough. That was actually more than enough. But February brought a thaw that didn't last, and then a cold snap that was worse than January, and by the time March arrived, they were both slightly worn at the edges in the way winter wore people on a mountain. Not broken, just used up and ready for something green. The letter from the territorial attorney's office arrived on the first day of March, carried by a rider from Harlan Creek who'd clearly been waiting for the pass to clear enough to make the trip. It was addressed to Gideon, but Evelyn was at the table when he opened it, and he read it aloud because there was no reason not to. Victor Blackthorne had been formally charged with fraud and falsification of official documentation under territorial law. Commissioner Pelham had resigned his position and was cooperating with the investigation. Robert Cutler had entered a full cooperation agreement and would not face criminal charges in exchange for complete testimony. The Blackthorne land holdings in the South Valley, parcels acquired over the last 18 months, including the 2 homesteads whose families had sold, were under review pending the outcome of the criminal proceeding. Gideon folded the letter. He sat with it for a moment. Not triumph. It wasn't that clean. 2 families had still sold their ground. Pelham had gone along with it until he was frightened enough to stop. Cutler had set false markers for money and only corrected it when it was already done. None of that was erased by a formal charge. The world didn't work that way. Things happened, and then they kept having happened, and the most you could say was that the forward motion of a bad thing had been stopped. But the forward motion had been stopped. "The Alderson families," Evelyn said. "If the acquired parcels are under review, it won't give them their land back automatically," Gideon said. "But it opens the question. If the acquisitions were tied to the fraud scheme, if Blackthorne used the same methods." He looked at the letter. "They should know about this." "Yes," she said. "They should." He looked at her across the table. The morning light was coming through the window at the angle it came in March, lower than winter, longer, the particular quality of light that was not yet warm but was no longer entirely cold. "We should go to them," he said. She met his eyes. "We should," she agreed. He noticed the we again, the way he'd noticed it in the barn in November. It had stopped being remarkable. That was its own kind of remarkable. How quickly something went from unfamiliar to simply true. Spring came to the mountain in the way spring always came, not all at once, but in arguments. A warm week followed by a hard freeze, snow that melted and came back, the creek swelling with runoff. Then one morning in early April, Gideon walked out before dawn, and the air had a smell that had been absent for 5 months. Something green underneath the cold, and he stood in the yard and breathed it and knew the season had turned. He went back inside and Evelyn was already up. She usually was, had been since the first week. And she was standing at the window with her coffee, and she looked at him when he came in and said, "It's turned, hasn't it?" "Yes," he said. She looked back out the window at the pre-dawn dark. "I want to start on the south slope this week. Ground's still cold." "I know. I want to start turning it anyway. Get a feel for it." He poured coffee and stood beside her at the window. Outside, the darkness was beginning its slow separation from the mountain shapes, the first gray light finding the ridge lines. "I've been thinking," she said. About what this place could be." She held the coffee in both hands. "Dutch said the valley families have trouble getting produce in winter. The general store in Harlan Creek, half the shelves are empty by February. Everything has to come from the south by stage." She paused. "This elevation, this aspect, we could grow things that keep. Root vegetables, winter squash, dried herbs. With the root cellar expanded, we could supply Harlan Creek through winter. Not just us. The valley." He looked at the window, at the ridge beginning to appear in the growing light. He thought about a garden he'd cleared 11 years ago and walked away from. About a woman who'd looked at the same ground and seen not the grief attached to it, but the soil underneath. "That's more than a kitchen garden," he said. "Yes," she said, "it is." He looked at her. There was a thing he'd understood somewhere in the last 4 months that he hadn't understood before, or hadn't been willing to understand, which was different. He'd built this mountain life as a fortress. Every decision, every piece of work, every year of rising before dawn and sleeping exhausted, he told himself it was strength, self-sufficiency, the dignity of needing no one. But there was a difference between strength and armor. He'd worn the armor so long he'd mistaken it for his own skin. And what Evelyn had done, not by pushing at it or asking him to remove it, but just by being present, by being real, by bringing her own damage and her own competence and her particular flat-voiced honesty into the same space he occupied, was show him the difference. Solitude wasn't strength. He'd been afraid of watching someone leave again, afraid of the cost of letting someone matter, afraid of the specific vulnerability of a man who needs people and knows it. He'd made that fear into a philosophy, and the philosophy into a life, and for 12 years he'd called it a choice. It wasn't a choice. It was just fear, wearing a better coat. The Valley Supply idea, he said. We'd need to bring Dutch in. He knows everyone in the South Valley, and the Aldersons have good storage on their property, if things go the way the attorney's office is suggesting. A cooperative arrangement, she said. Something like that. She turned from the window and looked at him with those brown eyes that had never once given him the easy version of anything. You're talking about community, she said. You specifically. He knew what she meant. Gideon Voss, who had spent 12 years making sure the mountain kept the world at a workable distance, was talking about supply chains and cooperative arrangements and bringing the valley in. I'm talking about it, he said. What changed? He looked at her, at the gray morning light on her face, at the coffee in her hands, at the ledger on the table behind her, the garden plans that had grown from 4 pages to 12, the neat columns of what to plant and when and where, the notes in the margins that were his handwriting and hers alternating without any particular plan. I got less afraid, he said. She held his gaze. That takes time, she said. It took about 4 months in a land fraud proceeding, he said. Something genuine moved through her face, the closest thing she had to a laugh, which was a controlled brightness in the eyes and the almost smile, here and gone quickly the way good things move through her. We should get to work, she said. We should, he agreed. Sick. They were married in April, on a Thursday, in the Harlan Creek Courthouse with Dutch Marin and 2 of the Alderson family as witnesses. The ceremony was short. The judge who performed it was not Carver. Carver was in Millhaven, but a local justice of the peace who read the words from the book and looked at both of them when they said theirs and seemed, in the way of people who do this work long enough, to recognize the particular quality of 2 people who mean what they're saying. Evelyn wore the dark dress. Gideon wore his better jacket, which Evelyn had mended the previous week without saying anything about it, so that he'd found it hanging on the peg with the frayed cuff repaired and the button properly reattached. He'd looked at it for a moment and then taken it down and put it on. Afterward, Dutch produced a bottle of the Marin apple brandy, and the 6 of them stood on the courthouse steps in the April cold and drank it. And Dutch made a speech that Gideon cut short after the second sentence, and Helen Alderson, who was 50 and had seen a great deal, looked at Evelyn and said simply, "Good woman," in a tone that meant the specific thing it was meant to mean, the recognition between people who've had to hold something hard and did. Evelyn received it without deflecting. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. On the ride back to the mountain, Gideon drove and Evelyn sat beside him the way she always sat, straight, hands in her lap, eyes on the landscape, and the valley opened around them in the April green that was just beginning, the first tentative color after months of white and gray. "You should know," she said, somewhere on the middle section of road, "that I'm not good at being easy to live with either." "I know," he said. "I've noticed. I have opinions about most things. I've noticed that too. And I'll keep working on the legal side of things, Cutler's case and the Alderson review. I can't just keep house and let that part of myself—" "Evelyn," he said. She stopped. "I know," he said. "That's why I married you." She was quiet. He kept his eyes on the road. "That's the most straightforward thing you've ever said to me," she said finally. "Don't get used to it," he said. She made the sound that wasn't quite a laugh, and he felt it in his chest the way he'd been feeling it for months. That small brightness, always unexpected, always real. The South Slope garden went in the 3rd week of April. It was harder work than Evelyn had anticipated, and exactly as hard as Gideon had expected, which he didn't say. The soil had compacted over 11 years since he'd last turned it, and there were rocks that hadn't been rocks before, or rather rocks that the frost cycles had worked to the surface over a decade of winters. They spent 3 full days clearing and turning and amending before a single seed went in. Evelyn worked beside him without complaint, and without pretending it wasn't hard. On the second day, she came in at noon with her hands bleeding at the knuckle where the shovel handle had worn through her gloves, and she looked at it with the matter-of-fact expression of someone taking inventory of a problem, and she went to the shelf for the lard tin and treated it and went back out. He watched her go and thought about the bruise on her cheek the day she'd stepped off the stagecoach, about the woman who had arrived on his mountain with one bag and no softness and no illusions, who had calculated the risk and found it acceptable and come anyway, who had brought herself fully, specifically, without apology, to a life that was hard and had made it something worth having. He thought about what it meant that she was still here, not just that she'd stayed, but that she'd stayed as herself, that she hadn't diminished, hadn't smoothed herself down to fit the space, hadn't become quieter or smaller or easier. If anything, she'd become more definite, more present, like something that had found the right kind of ground and was putting down roots. He thought about what Dutch had said once, in a different context, about the difference between surviving and living. Gideon had been surviving for 12 years. He'd been good at it. He'd built a life that could withstand almost anything the mountain threw at it. He'd just built it to withstand everything, including the things that weren't threats, including warmth, including need, including the ordinary human requirement of being known by someone else and knowing them back. He was learning to live again. It was slower than surviving and less straightforward, and it required a kind of attention he'd let atrophy. But it was real in a way that surviving, eventually, was not. On the third day of the garden work, in the late afternoon when the light was long and amber across the turned earth, Evelyn stopped and stood upright and looked at what they'd done. It was not beautiful. It was a rough rectangle of turned mountain soil with rocks piled at the edges and stakes driven to mark the rows, in a clearing that still showed the ghost of its 11 years of neglect. It was functional and hard-won and imperfect. "It's good," she said. Not rhapsodic, just the true thing. He stood beside her. The south-facing slope fell away below them toward the valley, and in the distance the ridgeline of the Bitterroot caught the last of the afternoon, and the air smelled of turned earth and the first real warmth of the season. "I walked away from this ground 11 years ago," he said. She looked at him. "I know," she said quietly. "I'm not walking away from it again." She looked back at the garden. The amber light was on her face, on the angular jaw, the steady eyes, the small lines of a person who had not had an easy life and had not been softened by that fact, only made more precise. "Neither am I," she said. They stood on the south slope as the light went and the valley went to shadow below them, and the mountain held them the way it had always held him, massive, indifferent, permanent. But it felt different now. The indifference felt different when you were not alone in it. The permanence felt different when you were building something that might outlast the season. He reached out and took her hand. Not a romantic gesture, or not only that, the gesture of a man who'd learned late and hard that this was what you did. You held on, to the ground, to the work, to the person standing next to you who had chosen, against reasonable odds, to be there. She held back. Her hand was rough from 3 days of digging, and cold, and entirely real. They stayed like that for a while as the light left the valley, and the stars came out over the Bitterroot one by one, the way they always came out, slowly at first, then all at once, the whole dark sky full of them. The territorial proceeding against Victor Blackthorne concluded 11 months later. He was found guilty on 4 counts of documentation fraud and 2 counts of fraudulent land acquisition. He was fined heavily and barred from conducting business in the territory. The parcels acquired through fraudulent means were ordered reviewed, and the Alderson family recovered their ground the following spring, not without difficulty, not without a fight, but they recovered it. Commissioner Pelham resigned permanently and left Harlan Creek. Robert Cutler gave full testimony, paid a civil fine, and went back to survey work in a different district, reportedly with considerable care about who he worked for. Dutch Marin came to dinner more often than was strictly necessary, and nobody objected. The South Slope garden produced its first real harvest that fall. Not a large one, not enough to supply the valley the way Evelyn had envisioned, but enough to prove the soil and the concept. The following year, they put in twice the acreage and brought in the Aldersons as partners. And the year after that, Harlan Creek's general store had a regular winter supplier for the first time in its history. Evelyn kept working on the legal side. Not officially still, because the territory did not license women to practice law, which was a fact she regarded with a flat, patient fury that she directed into careful, useful work rather than pointless anger. She helped 3 families in the valley contest bad contracts. She helped Cutler draft a deposition that held up in a related proceeding. She wrote letters to the Territorial Assembly that nobody answered yet, but that existed in the record. Gideon still went quiet sometimes. He still rose before dawn and found his best thinking in the company of horses and manual work and the mountain's particular brand of silence. He still had days when the words didn't come, and the world felt very far away, and the only thing that reached him was the physical fact of work. But he came back now. He came back because there was someone to come back to, and because he'd learned, slowly, imperfectly, without anything like grace, that coming back was not weakness. It was the harder thing. Staying closed was easy. You just stayed still. Coming back required movement, required the admission that you'd gone somewhere, required you to reach toward the person who'd kept the fire going while you were gone and say, with something other than words, "I know you did. I noticed. Thank you." He got better at it. Not good. Better. There was a difference, and both of them understood the difference, and neither of them pretended it was more than it was. That was the thing about people who'd both been hurt in different ways by the same basic failure. The failure of being seen inaccurately, of being asked to be something other than what you were. When 2 people like that find each other, they tend not to romanticize. They tend to be very exact about what's real. They hold what's real carefully, and they don't dress it up, because they know, from experience, that the dressed-up version doesn't survive the first hard winter. What Gideon and Evelyn built on that mountain survived many winters. It was not a perfect life. There were hard years and harder arguments and seasons when the whole thing felt like it was held together with rope and stubbornness and not much else. There were things he never fully told her and things she never fully told him, because people are not books, and some rooms stay closed, and that's just the truth of it. But it was a real life, specific and imperfect and earned. The man who had faced every storm alone, who had built his isolation into a philosophy, and his philosophy into a kind of pride, learned in the end that the strongest thing he ever did was not survive the 12 winters alone. It was let someone in at the start of the 13th. And the woman who had arrived with 1 bag and a fading bruise and a head full of legal knowledge and nowhere to put it, who had calculated the risk and found it acceptable and stepped down from the stagecoach into the cold Montana November and looked at a hard-faced man who didn't want her there, found in the end what she'd actually been looking for. Not just ground to stand on, ground that was worth standing on, ground she'd helped fight for and helped build and could finally call her own. The mountain kept them both. And they kept each other. That was enough. That was, as it turned out, more than enough.